What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and today I'll be going over my first impressions of Outlaw Rogue in Dungeons for the Shadowlands Beta. This will be without any conduits or legendaries, so bear that in mind as there is a good likelihood that those may drastically change the overall feel of the spec. I will give you some good news ahead of time though. Even without legendaries or conduits, our damage is pretty good, as I was in groups with multiple DPS that did have their legendaries and was still able to keep up and do higher overall damage. Anyways, I don't want to spoil too much, so let's roll that intro and start talking about dungeons. Outlaw Rogues and Dungeons. The two go together like full motion video games and bad acting. You'll rarely see one without the other. For a sizable portion of BFA, Outlaw was considered a veritable deity of dungeon content. But how is it holding up so far in the Shadowlands Beta? This will be a recap/analysis type video of what I've come across in my first week of running dungeons as Outlaw in the beta, though I will preface that these are not Mythic Plus runs yet, though I will be getting a look at those soon enough. I just hope Blizzard decides to finally put in the conduits and legendaries so we can start testing them and see what we can really do. If you aren't certain of all the changes that have already been made for Outlaw in Shadowlands, I highly recommend checking out the video I did on that topic a couple days ago, as otherwise some of this commentary might not make as much sense to you. I'll leave a link up in the top right corner if you need it. And also, these results might change based on your Covenant choice, as a majority of my testing so far has been done with the Necrolord Covenant, which is something I will bring up in this video too. Alright, so of the dungeons I've done so far, I've come to a few conclusions about Outlaw in its current state. One of the hottest topics on Outlaw right now, as I've seen in the comments, is the new iteration of Roll the Bones. For those who didn't know, Roll the Bones is being moved to a cooldown and will cost energy, whereas the current version does not have a cooldown but costs combo points and energy. And it will give a flat amount of 30 seconds for every time you roll a buff. The pandemic refresh does still apply to it, so if you can re-roll before your buffs fall off, you can get more time out of your next set of buffs. This is possible by all means depending on what buffs you roll. Getting buffs like True Bearing, Broadside, or Skull and Crossbones will give you a better chance at having a pandemic refresh when you re-roll. This results in the first issue I've come across with the spec though, because if you're burning through combo points quickly, you'll potentially run into energy starvation. This isn't that surprising to me, as the gear that they give you is pretty limited in terms of haste for the beta, and overall it's about what I expected for early game Outlaw Rogue anyways, or just really any rogue in general. I'm still not very keen on the new version of Roll the Bones though, and the new Grand Melee buff feels really weak. While I'm sure it helps by not having to waste energy/combo points on refreshing Slice and Dice, it doesn't make your abilities feel more powerful, which is kind of off-putting. Heck, even Buried Treasure feels like a better buff at this point, and that's scary. Due to this energy issue though, Adrenaline Rush actually feels like a cooldown again, which is something, I guess. Having it up definitely gives the spec its usual, relatively quick pace, which helps it retain that similar feel to its BFA iteration. I also have been using the Marked for Death talent, as I'm trying to get as much use out of the Restless Blades passive as I can for more cooldown recovery. This might be part of the cause for the energy starvation moments I've run into, however even when running Vigor, the only difference I noticed was I was re-rolling less because I wasn't going through combo points as quickly for Restless Blades to affect my Blade Rush, Roll the Bones, or Adrenaline Rush as much as I was with Marked for Death. And this also resulted in some scenarios where I didn't have Roll the Bones off cooldown yet, which was pretty annoying. Up next we'll talk about the new version of Blade Flurry, which has sadly been target capped and put on a 30-second cooldown with no extra charges, and honestly, it actually doesn't play that bad. I mean, yeah, the target capping sucks, but a vast majority of the moves have been target capped in the game, so that's apparently the new norm in Shadowlands. However, I feel that it's actually as easy, if not easier, to keep Blade Flurry rolling for multiple charges, and I haven't even been using Dancing Steel yet, which will probably make it even easier to have uptime with this than it is in BFA. The little AoE burst effect they added to Blade Flurry is not some mind-altering or earth-shattering effect to change the spec, but it is a nice little bit of extra damage, so I won't stick my nose up at it or anything like that. Blizzard wanted the ability to feel more powerful, especially when you're pressing something that's on the GCD, hence the addition, and I can't quite say it does that in my opinion. But I will say that Outlaw's AoE is still quite strong, even without conduits or legendaries, which is very promising to say the least. All in all, this actually wasn't a terrible change for Blade Flurry other than the target capping, so I'm pretty okay with it. In conjunction with Blade Flurry, I've come to like Blade Rush quite a bit more as of now in dungeons, and that's for a couple reasons. Blade Rush gives back energy over time, which helps bring some life back into the rotation outside of Adrenaline Rush windows. I honestly can't imagine how slow the spec would play without those little extra spurts of energy, but I will be trying to run Dancing Steel a little more often to get a fair comparison between the two. The real nice part about Blade Rush though, is it has not been given a target cap like all of the other AoE components for the spec, which means on pulls with lots of adds, you do get a nice big burst of AoE, which is good to see. The theory crafters out there will eventually determine which one's actually better, but in terms of how it feels and for early game content, Blade Rush seems like a solid choice. The new iteration of Between the Eyes is a bit hit or miss for me, pun intended. But this might be due to my Covenant and talent choices. The problem I'm having so far with Between the Eyes is that on trash packs, it's highly unlikely that you will see the full duration of 15 seconds of crit damage and crit chance bonus. On boss fights this is easily attainable, but on trash this is unlikely at best. That, and due to the nature of the buff, you'll want to focus all damage on said target for as much of the duration of the buff as possible, which means getting any interrupts or CCs out during that time becomes a bit of a nuisance. This issue is further exacerbated if you're trying to maximize the amount of mark for death spams you can get out, as without a mouse over macro you will most likely be losing some GCDs and auto attack damage on your main target. In higher keys I'm sure these issues will be slightly less noticeable, as it's much more likely for targets to live for the full duration of the buff, but in lower content this ability really only sees truly effective use on boss fights. Speaking of boss fights, our single target damage seems about relatively on par with where it was before, so not exactly the greatest right now. However, I have a feeling it will improve as we gain more critical strike, as we'll be more likely to trigger that extra damage bonus from our Between the Eyes debuff that we apply, and as we get more geared we will be applying this debuff at a higher and more frequent rate, so I'm still optimistic of our patchwork style damage potential. This will no doubt make the Ruthless Precision Roll the Bones buff even more critical than it was before, as between our 10% base crit chance as a rogue, plus the 20% from Ruthless Precision, and the 20% from the Between the Eyes debuff, all of our damage will at least have a 50% critical hit chance against our primary target. Of course, we can't just fish for Ruthless Precision buffs anymore, so that's just peachy. Sigh. Slice and Dice does seem to be normalizing our damage quite a bit, as melee auto attacks seem to make up a respectable portion of our damage, more so than usual. I wish I could say the same for instant poison, as it seems to only equate to like 1 to 2% of our total damage. But anyways, Slice and Dice definitely makes a noticeable improvement in our combat potency procs, as I did a couple 5-minute test dummy fights where I wouldn't use Roll the Bones at all, and only rolled Slice and Dice in every other test. It basically worked out to about 2100-ish energy generated by combat potency while using Slice and Dice, and only around 1400-ish energy without the buff being active. So about 2.3 extra energy per second while you have the buff rolling. So basically you just want to make sure you never lose it. Next, I wanted to talk about my Covenant of choice for Outlaw. This may change in the future or after just a bit more testing, however I'm already somewhat worried about Covenant ability strength. When I did my first video covering the Covenant abilities and rogue specific ones, I was pretty smitten with the Necrolords due to the ability Serrated Bone Spike. Well, now that there are mostly working damage meters in the beta, I can say that Bone Spikes do a lot of damage, like 20% of my overall damage. While that sounds like it should be something to be excited about, it worries me because I didn't notice nearly as huge of a power increase with any other Covenant ability when I was just messing around with them. Like, not even remotely close to that amount of damage. And for some of us, that's perfectly fine, if you're looking at what does the most damage / performs best. Or if you already planned on going Necrolord, then that's great too. But for people that really wanted to use one of the other Covenants as their stronghold of choice, this can become a bit of a dilemma. This move generates so many combo points for so cheap, it's pretty absurd. Basically, if you have the spike dot on 2 targets, the next time you use it on any target, even ones you've already hit, you'll get 3 combo points for 10 energy. That's nuts. In 2 target boss fights, this is a crazy good Covenant ability. Even in raw single target, it'll still give you 2 combo points for every 10 energy you spend on it. And the fact that this puts a damage over time effect on a target that lasts forever means you'll always be doing damage, even if it's a small amount, which is an issue Outlaw has had to overcome for its entire existence. Not having any damage over time in our toolkit makes long distance target swapping or dealing with mechanics a major DPS loss. The other huge benefit to Bone Spike is that because it's such a cheap generator, it can be used to fill spots in our rotation where our energy's basically tapped out, but we can still get combo points built up. And in Mythic Plus, the fact that this gives you a charge every time a target dies with the Bone Spike on it is huge. Basically, you get the charges back every time you have these dots out. The only time you lose any charges is if you hit the same target multiple times, but if you're just putting this on multiple targets and letting them just fall off when they die, you'll basically have all your charges back for the next pack, which is nuts. And again, this should be fantastic news that we got such a good Covenant ability, but for some people this is going to be exactly what they were worried about with Covenants and the abilities that come with them. They'll feel forced into playing a version of the game that isn't what they wanted. I, for one, was super excited the minute I saw Revendreth and all the Venthyr stuff, because to me they have some of the coolest weapons and armor and stuff in Shadowlands. However, I'm also one who is practical with what I want from the game. I want to have things that improve my performance and gameplay, especially when it comes to Mythic Plus. So eventually I'll just make an alt for each Covenant so I can see everything Shadowlands will have to offer, but for others this may not be an option, or they just may not see it that way, which I entirely understand. Class fantasy is a big thing for a lot of folks, so making your Death Knight a Kyrian or a Night Fae or whatever just because their class ability is so good that you can't not have it just might not sit well with some people. While I'm still not 100% certain on some of the changes made to Outlaw, I will say overall it feels pretty solid in dungeons, and with the right Covenant abilities it has some pretty impressive 2 to 3 target cleave now, even more than it used to. The energy issue is always something that comes up in low item levels / early tiers of expansions, so I'm not too worried about that yet. Between the Eyes feels kinda clunky to use on trash packs, to be honest, though it's probably just a learning curve to maximize its usefulness, and it has to do with the level of the content you're doing. The new Roll the Bones is honestly a step in the wrong direction, I feel, especially as the spec can very easily shift from not having enough combo points to not having enough energy, and either way it doesn't feel good. I do plan on doing a video once I get some Mythic Plus time in on the beta, but I wanted to start with just baseline dungeons to get a feel for the encounters and the playstyle at the same time. That, and I've been suffering through the laggy nightmare that is Castle Nathria during the somewhat limited testing window, which has taken up quite a bit of time. I'll be sure to keep you all posted on what I've come across or how things are progressing on the beta as it moves along, and hopefully one of my next videos will be about conduits and legendaries once Blizzard finally decides to put out. If you guys like the video, you should take a peek at some of my other content. I do uploads every weekday and cover both beta and retail content. Feel free to ask any questions in the comment section about this or any other video, as I try my best to answer back as promptly as I can. Thank you all so much for watching, this is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.